I've talked to a lot of people who empathically co-lived the dying life review of a person who was passing away. As my mother was dying, the room we were in changed geometrical configuration. I was no longer in a three-dimensional space. Where I think the self resides is your story. Consciousness itself is a narrative phenomenon. That's what people with a near-death experience say, that suddenly time stands still and your story gets divided into a bazillion little bits. To go back to here, you drink from the river of forgetfulness, whose waters no vessel can contain, and you forget all you know. I'm not afraid of death. No, it's life that scares me. I tell you. Somebody who wants to know whether God exists is trying to draw this circle of a concept around God. Any belief would be bound to be off base. Now, one of the wildest things I know, Amrit, is what struck me at age 7 or 8 looking through a telescope was an experience that you had, probably everybody listening to this had, where you think, how big is this thing we're in? So your mind goes out to the wall, but then you say, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? So my point, my realization I made at that age 7 or 8 was that this thing we're in really doesn't make any sense. It's unintelligible, and that's all right. And so when I went to college at age 18, I intended to be an astronomy major, but I took a course in philosophy because I'd been interested in philosophy in high school. And I really, in reading the first few pages of Plato's Republic, I was hooked. So at that very moment, I decided to be a philosophy major, right? And something that a lot of the folks listening to us, I think, will find interesting is that the Republic begins when Socrates, who's then about 20 years of age, is walking down to the Piraeus, down to the port city with his friends. And on the way down there, they meet a guy who's about as old as you are now, Amrit, and who's been very successful, right, in his business. And so Socrates, who's then a young man, says, well, what's it like at your age, Kephalos? And he said, well, I spent my whole life, Socrates, in work attending to my business. And I inherited money from my father. I added a lot to it. And now I'm going to have some to pass along to my children. And, and I spent my life was absorbed in this business. And he said, and now that I've reached this age, my mind goes back to the stories about the afterlife I heard when I was a kid. And that was the first time, Amrit, that I had thought about the afterlife. I didn't realize that anybody thought it was, I didn't realize anybody took it seriously. I thought it was kind of a premise of I just didn't know. I didn't pay any attention to it. But that woke me up. And so this book, The Republic, goes through, and the culmination of the Republic is the first near-death experience I ever read about. And it is a story of which Plato took very seriously, of a soldier who was apparently killed in battle, but who revived at the funeral, and told about he got out of his body and he went through a passageway into another world, and he saw all these things. And I was very intrigued with that story, which Plato took very seriously. And I asked my professor, what is this about? And he said that the early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were apparently dead but who had revived. And it was apparently then obviously a very rare phenomenon, but it happened once in a while. And when they did, they had these stories to tell. And the Greek philosophers had two different views about it. Plato took them seriously as indicators of an afterlife. But just a little bit before Plato, actually, previous decades, there was a philosopher, Democritus, who had just figured out from the fact that a line can be divided into infinite points, right? And from the fact that two things can touch, that therefore there has to be a smallest piece, right? Which he called atoms, right? And so he said, in writing about these things, he said, well, there's no such thing as a moment of death, he said. It's a process. And he said, what these experiences are, they are the residual biological activity of the body, even when the body appears dead, that you can't see because it's going on the level of atomic, which is the same, you know, hypothesis that people advance today, except they say oxygen deprivation to the brain is the way they say it today, right? So it never occurred to me that this might be something still in the mind. I thought of it in terms of Greek philosophy. But in 1965, I heard a Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, who had such an experience. And George was the first person I heard this from. And then, even when I was still in graduate school, I heard another guy, there in Charlottesville, Virginia. But then, when I started teaching philosophy, after I got my PhD, I heard this story from students and from my colleagues, and then they want you to come to the civic clubs, right? And the guys there say, "Oh yeah, that happened to me." So that's how I got started. But yeah,
And I think well, it's interesting because you also said Plato and Democritus have set the tone for the study of the afterlife, and like, yeah, the fact that there's an indicator of the afterlife, the fact that it's contrary to the idea of solidity, that we've got these atoms. Has much changed in our awareness since then? If they've set the tone,
yes,
like,
yeah. I think that what is happening is, in terms of reason, which I'm very interested in. I was a professor of philosophy and I taught logic. I mean, reason is very important to me. And even at the very beginning of reason, there was the quest for a rational proof of an afterlife. As a matter of fact, Amrit, there's a very strange thing, which is that you come from, I guess, or were you family from India, maybe, or where?
yeah, definitely, yeah,
Okay, well,
Northern
great,
India.
and that's a different tradition. But in the West, see, logic is different in India, as you know. It's the syllogism has 5 terms, right, instead of 3,
Mm.
right? So it's a different system. But in the Western, the Greek way of doing it, um, the one of the very first questions that the philosophers asked when they were trying to figure out the principles of reason and logic was the question of life after death. So if you think about it, a notion of life after death is already built into the system of reason we are using. There is a kind of ghostly imprint. There's a kind of ghostly imprint in the very notion of reason and logic as we have it in the West. And so, what that results in the complication, see, is that when you try to use reason to think about life after death, you are kind of reasoning in a circle, right? And what the outcome of the Western tradition in trying to prove an afterlife has been formulated very well by David Hume in the 18th century, who said By the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, that is an understatement, right? But he went on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And he was saying, what he was saying in a kind of ironic way was that it's impossible, right? Because he said the logic we have is not commensurate with the question of life after death. Now, as the centuries up, back at that time, it was pretty dangerous to talk about the afterlife, if you know what I mean. This was Hume wouldn't let his essay on immortality be published while he was still alive. And, they were still afraid of all that church stuff. But then once things got loosened up in the early 20th century, the logical empiricist movement in Europe, they began to thinking about, and they realized, which is the reality was, that when we say there is a life after death, we may feel good feelings and have good feelings, and we may see images in our mind. But when we really get down to it, there's no cognitive content to it, right? It's like A.J. Ayer said. He said, it makes sense in our language to say that a man survived a total change of personality, right? Or that a man survived a total loss of memory, right? But he said it's a self-contradiction to say that a man survives the annihilation of his body. And but people try to defend about that by using metaphysical word like soul, oh my soul, what is that? If we are to be intellectually honest, this is a hard thing to pin down. But where I have come on it, Amrit, is that I give up. I can't think my way out of it. By which I mean, I hate the way that people who think they know what they're talking about use that word skeptic, right? Like, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, that makes me so, angry not because of anything to do with near-death experiences, but from the fact that I love to teach Greek philosophy. It's just great. It's the most fascinating story of history. Well, let me tell you about the skeptics, okay? After Aristotle codified logic, right? That was the result of a long couple of 3 centuries almost collective effort to formulate the principles of reason to find out about the world. And when we got up to logic with Aristotle, that was in a way, it stuck because it was so useful that it just leaked out and everybody is born. It's not you're born with it, but you learn it because it's built into the system of thinking that we work by, right? It's you're taught a little bit about logic in school, but not much. It's just absorbed, right? Because people know those rules. And what happens after logic got codified, then the philosophers who came along afterward in what is called the Hellenistic age, that was defined by Alexander's conquest, right? And the Hellenistic philosophers, one group of them was called the skeptics. And the founder of the skeptical movement was Pyrrho, Pyrrho. And Pyrrho's take it this, by the way, at the time we're talking about here, see, largely in my opinion, thanks to the American Revolution and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, people like that, see. In Europe, the universities were under the thumb of the church, right? So there was not a clear distinction between the intellectual and the spiritual quest. And that was certainly true at the time of Plato and Aristotle. They wouldn't understand, you're trying to figure what the difference between the intellectual quest and the spirit. They wouldn't have any, what are they talking about, right? Now we can understand it, because the universities got separated with Jefferson and Franklin. But anyway, so Spiro said his philosophy was just as much a spiritual practice as it was an intellectual practice. And Pyrrho knew logic very well. Right? And so Pyrrho said, if you think about it, logic is a tool, like an instrument or a machine, let's say, for generating conclusions from premises, right? You put in the premises and generate the conclusions, right? And so Pyrrho said, well, what if we really bear down? We really crank it, really just we ask every question, we really bear down. But in the end, we refrain from drawing a conclusion. That is the essence of being a skeptic. That's what it meant. And it was a spiritual practice because they found that if they did it repeatedly as a spiritual discipline, it really opens your mind. I've done it all my life, just kind of that's what I do. But it really does. It opens your mind in a new way. Now, but also, if you think about it geometrically, and everyone else is rushing in the same direction to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to hold back and to refrain from drawing a conclusion. That shows you side pathways that everybody else missed because they're headed in this way. See what I mean? You see, if you're a skeptic, since you're not looking this way, you see things along the side roads that everybody else missed.
Inspired soul, lumen beings, guests like Raymond Moody. I can't believe he's here on the podcast. He literally coined the term near-death experience. Everything you see around here, this platform, this channel, the movement, the community, is powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. Thank you so much to all of you that are subscribed. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. As I'm saying the word subscribe, the button below is lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution. Please hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, join the movement, join the community, spreading wisdom, love, positivity like this around the planet together. Thank you so much in advance for doing so. And on that note, recently we hit 250,000 subscribers. And to give back, we're giving access to our online circle community. To the community, you can use the link just here or in the description below. Join us in the community circle, guests coming on every month to answer the question directly of the audiences, weekly community gatherings, meditations, community members offering breath work. There's lots going on in the community space online. So join us in the online community circle for the Inspired Evolution. We'd love to see you there amongst the family. Back to Dr. Raymond in today's episode. There is also this element of you're inviting in an immense amount of overwhelm as you're building pressure towards the outcome.
Yeah.
To that you're trying to get to, but then not releasing it, and that pressure you're sort of like having to learn to bear it down, which is also why I can see like it's an intellectual pursuit, but it's like a spiritual. Yeah.
In terms of that, get this: Pyrrho was one of the philosophers that Alexander took with him to India, and when he was over there, Pyrrho got consorted with the Buddhists, the early Buddhists. And he came back a Buddhist. He perambulated and he meditated. And nowadays, with that knowledge, listen to the people who falsely call themselves skeptics. They don't know what they're talking about. Oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. That is a self-contradiction because what they're saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. See, it's like ignorance, but it's like that's the reason I get angry about it. Because see, when I have philosophy students, they are corrupted by these people who don't know what they're talking about. But in terms of that kind of standard objection to near-death experiences, that it's not the afterlife, it's just the chemistry of the brain. The trouble with that is that bystanders at the death of someone else who are not themselves ill or injured nonetheless regularly have the elements of near-death experiences. For example, that as their loved one dies in the bed, they say, as grandma died, I got out of my body and went part way toward with her toward this light. Or people say that they see the apparitions of their dying relatives, loved ones coming in as though to take them away. They say the room fills with light. Some people say they hear wonderful music. It's, just a whole medley of elements of near-death experiences which occur not just to somebody who's almost dying, but to people who are standing around who are not ill or injured. And so there's got to be something else than just oxygen deprivation to the brain. Now, one of the wildest things I know, Amrit, is that it's, as I guess, fairly common because I've talked to a lot of people who empathically co-lived the dying life review of a person who was passing away. And that just sounds shocking to me. I mean, I'm going to be embarrassed enough by my life review, without having the spectator looking in. But people say nonetheless, they say, well, no, it sounds unnatural, but in the circumstance, it's very natural. And in a way, I mean, it's we all have the same, secrets basically. It's sexual or aggressive, right?
Dr. Raymond, I do want to dive in deeper into the hallmarks of near-death experience, and then what you're referring to there is a shared death experience. But just before we do, because we're still kind of in this, I just want to ask about Erasmus, because his work was really important as well to some of the foundations of how we study this work as well. Can you tell us a little bit about Erasmus? Because Aristotle mentioned him 280 years later. Erasmus
Oh,
being this guy that could,
Hermotimus.
sorry,
Yeah,
Erasmus,
yeah.
that could, I
This is
think,
pretty
can you just
wild.
bring us into context of that, and then we'll get into, just what your forensic psychology, and then, shared death experiences and all the hallmarks of near death. We'll get into all of them.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, Hermotimus was the out-of-body traveler of antiquity. And he was this was probably roughly, say, 700 to 600 BCE. It was before the classical age of Greece. This is what is in what called the archaic age. And Hermotimus had the ability to leave his body at will to travel to great distances and to report what was going on. And the significance of him, from my point of view as a philosophy, interest in philosophy, is that I think he was probably the person, see, that gave these early philosophers the idea, oh, there's two parts of us, right? There's the body and it's two different things. So he was very important in that transition to wake people up to the and then from there you see there's a tradition of let's try to figure out um, how they're related, right? And so one of the early figures in this was Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was one of the inventors of the idea of the immaterial, immortal soul. And at the time of Pythagoras, this notion of the immaterial, immortal soul was capable of reincarnation and also transmigration. Those were doctrines of the Pythagoreans, that you could when you died, that you could have another human incarnation, or you could be in another animal, another kind of animal. And the Pythagoreans, interestingly, Amrit, had a practice whereby, by the way, this time we're talking about there is literacy, but it's confined to a small number of people, right? At the time of Pythagoras, there's language, but just it's for specialists, right?
A knowledgeable elite.
Right. And so the memory was very important. If we were suddenly transported back to antiquity, we would think literally that people were magic, right? Because, like, how in the world can they remember all of this? Like, if you only get one trip to the city a year from supplies from the farm, you better have a pretty good list, right? But how can you have a list? How can you have a list if there's no writing? Well, they did it by something called memory theaters. Everybody knew a certain government building, right? So you would put the bale of sugar, or the bale of fish, and the entree of the big bill, and just do it like that. But to us it looks like magic. But before writing, see, and so what the Pythagoreans did was that every morning before they got out of bed, they would rehearse every single action they had taken the day before in detail, go over it in their mind before they would get out of bed. And then if they got proficient at that, and this is the part where I'm sure a lot of them just went crazy and had to be taken out in a straitjacket. that then you could go back the day before, so that every morning. Now they did this because they were trying to plan, like, to improve their memory so that when they had the choice of their next incarnation, see, they could do it from a very practiced and wise way. Now, Empedocles, who was a Greek philosopher kind of across the Mediterranean there on Sicily, and he was an evoker of the dead at one of the oracles of the dead on the Mount Etna, right? And he said he took the Pythagorean view of the soul up, and he too said that he remembered his past lives not just as a human, but also as different animal species. Now, one thing about this that is really interesting from the point of view of Hermotimus, you mentioned that Pythagoras claimed to remember 8 of his past lives. And one of his past lives was Hermotimus. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. Now, after Pythagoras, Plato took up this idea of the immaterial, immortal soul. And it was in his dialogue Phaedo that he lays this out. And so when the Christians came along, they didn't have much to go on about the afterlife because, just the Christian and Jewish scriptures didn't have much to say. So what the early church fathers did was they adopted Plato's Phaedo as the Christian theology of the afterlife. And that's why there's all this stuff about the immaterial, immortal soul, see, which came from Pythagoras through Plato, which then they took up. Now, flash forward. If you think about it, from about the year of 400, I guess, when the Christians got hold of the Phaedo, up until around the 1600s, where there was a kind of loosening, you better not talk much about life after death, right? So there wasn't much progress. But once it started loosening up a little bit and people were a little less afraid of the church authorities, like the curmudgeon Thomas Hobbes in England, and he pointed out that, just a minute here, it doesn't make any sense to talk about immaterial, immortal. So, what are we talking about here? There's no content to it. And, people were afraid just to point that obvious thing out, up to then. But, now it's a little looser. So, well, it's what are we talking about here? It's not very clear. People were trying to get down clear concepts because, science was beginning to kind of bud, right? And then, and 100 years later or so, John Locke, also interested in the question, he was trying to rescue it. I mean, surely there's something. But what he said is that our self consists of our memories and our consciousness. Well, then go another 100 years and you get to David Hume, the skeptic, and he says, frankly, when I look inside of myself, I don't see any permanent substrate. It's all just the passing impression of the moment, right? So the whole notion of the self gets disturbed, right? Now, flash forward where I'm on this is that I just think that where I think the self resides is your story. It's consciousness itself is a narrative phenomenon. Think of it. Because when some new event happens to you, your mind automatically folds it into your continuing story, right? And so what you are is your story in the end. That's what people with a near death experience say, that suddenly time stands still and your story gets divided into a bazillion little bits. And you see each part of it not just from the point of view you had when you were doing it, but from the point of view of the other characters involved. And movies used to end that way, right? They'd have a little zip, like a flashback at the end, right? And it's interesting that this figure that people are with, they say Christ or the light or God, but they say that he's aware of your story.
Because that's maybe this is an opportune moment to dive into the hallmark features of what because you've spent 5 decades, decades being 10 years, studying these near-death experiences. You literally coined the term near-death experience for those that are tuning in and aren't aware, getting their bearings around Dr. Raymond Moody here. Yeah, I mean, because there's one moment where you're leaving and there is this presence / body of light next to you as you're doing the review. But maybe I'm jumping ahead of us here. Maybe you can guide us through, you said there's about 15 to 20 pretty stereotypical things. Not stereotypical, sorry, that sounds blasphemous.
I'll just start with this one, right? But basically, it's it's a family resemblance. Like, which I mean is that near-death experiences, I've talked to thousands of people, right? And if you look at the whole picture, there's about, say, 15 or so elements that crop up in near-death experiences. But not every near-death experience has every one of the elements. Generally, what people say is, in a very similar scenario would be, people say that my heart stopped beating, I got out of my body, I could see the resuscitation from above, and I went through a passageway into a bright light. I experienced things I can't put into words. There are no words for this, but it's like I was in an environment of complete love and peace and comfort. And I saw there my relatives and friends who had passed away, or they're in spirit form to meet me. And then at some point, everything else just kind of disappears. Time stands still, and you are surrounded by a panorama which consists of every single thing you have ever done in your life, right? And when you see it from the perspective you had when you did it, but also simultaneously from the perspective of the other person involved. So if you see yourself doing an unkind thing, which I never did. I'm not worried about this myself because I have never done a single unkind thing to anybody. Just kidding, just kidding. And so people say that, or if you see yourself doing a good thing, you feel the good feelings you brought about with you, right? And throughout this, this being is there with you as an educator. It's like this being is there and to sort of ask you questions about it. But pretty much everybody say there's no words, but that it's kind of like you interpret the communication with this presence as though it were a question, even though there are no words, right? And it's something like, how have you learned to love? And the answer is obvious because it's right there. It's just to get you to think about it, right? And so when people come back from this, some people say, I have no idea how I got back. It's one moment I was in this light, then how I'm back. Other people say that they said, it's not your time to come yet. You got things you got to complete. You got to go back. And a third group are given a choice that you can stay in what you're in now, or you can return to the light you've been leading. And not too surprisingly, all the ones I've talked to, they chose to come back at that point. But, so I can't say for those who didn't, but the ones who come back tell me that there is always the reason is for somebody else, right? They say, and it's most commonly because they have young children left to raise. It's the most common, right? But they say, for me, I would rather have been there. I chose to come back on behalf of my whoever, right? And so now, one thing about that, we can make a startling and sensational conclusion just based on that life review. We don't have to go, we can't go as far as there is life after death from it, but we can go this far to say absolutely that for at least many of us, life is a two-phase process. First, you live it through as the protagonist or the actor. Then time stands still and you re-witness the same events from the point of view, in a timeless state, from the point of view of the other people involved. And that is phenomenal information in itself. And absolutely correct. All right.
This podcast is brought to you by my one-to-one mentorship. The podcast is designed to inspire your evolution onwards, upwards, and inwards. And if you're ready to dive in even deeper and evolve your career, your leadership, and business in a conscious direction, and you believe that alignment to your purpose and your soul's direction is the only way to truly thrive into your highest potential, and right now you can feel that guidance, mentoring, and coaching would be of support, then my one-to-one mentorship, coupled with our incredible conscious group masterminds, is here for you. Thousands of people have evolved through my mentoring over the last 10 years. It is, after all, my highest calling, and here's what they have to say about how it's transformed their life.
I've had massive transitions while working with Amrit.
I'm processing things in real time. I'm addressing what I want to do, and so much more is possible.
Amrit sessions were really helpful. They inspired me to go after my dream job, which I have now, and I'm loving it.
Amrit doesn't really see it as just coaching, but he honestly cares about you, and you can feel it. That's just priceless. I just love it.
If you're looking for someone to help you evolve as a person, hands down, Amrit.
So if you're ready to dive in even deeper to take your inspirations and truly evolve, then make your way over to my website at amritsandu.com. I'll put a link in the description below. You don't have to go it alone. There's one-to-one mentoring and an incredible community mastermind of conscious leaders, entrepreneurs, and people transforming their careers and business into full alignment with their soul's highest calling creating a life that inspires them on the deepest level, living into their greatest impact. And as many of you know, connection is my highest value, so I'm looking forward to connecting with you. Use the button below, use the link below, amritsandhu.com/call. That's AMRIT, Sandhu, SANDHU.com/call. It's on screen for you now. And if you follow that link, you'll be able to book in a call directly with me. I'm looking forward to connecting with you. So go on, I'll see you there. Yeah, that's fascinating. How have you learned to love? I mean, that really stood out to me, like that question in particular that you're asked, how have you learned to love, sort of has some, I don't want to say implications because that sounds a bit severe as a word, but it has some reflections on the meaning of life, I guess.
Yeah. That's right.
So it's interesting because some people are going through these experiences on their own, and this is the experience they're going to have. And at some point, you're looking for, okay, this is a felt sentence and a particular experience for some people. When some people are coming back and documenting and reporting on it, you're studying near-death experiences, life after life, but then you're also got this lens of like, I'm looking for proof.
Mm.
And at some point, this concept of shared death experiences starts to pop through. Can you tell us a little bit about your pursuit for proof, firstly, but then also like what is a shared death experience? And there's this real deep fascination. I know I'm asking a few questions at once, but you don't actually have to be kind of kindred to be in a shared death experience as well. That sort of buzzed me out. Can you talk to that, please?
Yeah, and about this thing about proof, Amrit, I'm just, I was a professor of logic, right? And I'm fascinated by the concept of proof. Well, one reason I'm fascinated by it was that it was one of the original quests of the Greek philosophers. When they were setting up logic as you and I are using it now. By the way, in India, the traditional logic has a 5-term syllogism, right?
Can you
However,
unpack that a little bit? The 5 and the 3. I'd love to hear more about what that actually
well,
means.
it's like syllogisms,
Is,
like Aristotle put the syllogistic logic, right? Like there's 250 different six, like all A, all S or P, some S or P, and all like different combinations, right? And in India, there's 5 terms where the Aristotelian syllogism has 3 terms. Okay, but people in India say that the advantage of the 5-term syllogism is that it's more understandable to people, right? It gives them a thorough understanding. But the same people in India say that when you're trying to figure out the truth, it's the Western system is better. Yeah.
why is that the case? I don't fully understand
know.
syllogism.
I don't know. But I mean, I can get the idea that the Indian syllogism kind of breaks the process into more steps, right? So that would, I guess that's what it meant, right?
Right, because it's good trying to get more fidelity. It's great away from the source. It's broken further apart from the source of truth.
Yeah, but
so syllogism being deductive reasoning in certain ways, is that right? There's
well, I mean, sort of. It's like I said, I don't understand. I'm just my area in
Understood this to
logic
be the
is I'm
case.
very interested in one specific question, which is what makes something unintelligible. And we're totally wrong about the way we think about unintelligible. People think of nonsense and unintelligibility as something, if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, okay?
Yes.
Most people think of unintelligible nonsense as something down here, sublinguistic. But in reality, that's not the case. Nonsense and unintelligible language is something that accrues on the top of ordinary meaningful language. So it's more complex because all meaningful sentences and language can be characterized just by characterizing them by referring to the rules of meaning that they follow, right? But when you're dealing with nonsense, you have to deal not just with the rules that it follows, but also with the rules that it breaks. And what that means is that unintelligibility itself is an intelligible phenomenon. And there's many different patterns to it. Listen to this. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." That's unintelligible nonsense, right?
Now I'm starting to step into your world of forensic psychology.
Now listen to this. Now listen to this. "Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of purple spontaneity." That's nonsense too, but it's a different type of nonsense, isn't it? Now listen to this. "That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county." That's nonsense too, right? But it's a different type. Now listen to this. "Hat thoroughly the if will zoom house est." That's nonsense too, but yet a different. Or it goes on and on forever. But all different types of unintelligible language have a common structural phenomenon, namely that they follow some of the rules of language but break other rules of language so that the outcome doesn't make any sense. And knowing that, you can actually design nonsense to do different things.
This is really fascinating because what you're talking about is different layers of what I'm interpreting as different layers of coherence between chaos in the approach towards order. And it's really fascinating for me because I've got young kids at the moment and you can sort of see that they're unintelligible in a certain way, but there's a deeper level of intelligence emerging from the chaos as they're trying to build consistent coherence towards order, right? Like my little one, he's trying to reach for things at the moment and he can't articulate what he wants. He's like, and he's trying to get towards that coherent order. Once that clicks in, he'll stay there. But you're saying there's even potentially disruptive patterns, and maybe that leans into your forensic
actually, I've been
psychology
able to
work
teach.
there.
I've taught courses in unintelligibility in my philosophy classes and psychology classes going back into the early 70s. And so, I got a lot of experience with this. And what students say is, and this has been consistent over many years, is that when they learn these different patterns, see, then I say, once they learn a pattern, then I say, now write your own examples of it, right? And then once they write their own original examples of multiple types of nonsense, but each one I say, write it's an unintelligible sentence by this pattern. And then once they finish that, I say, and I get them actually to write two of them. It helps to do two examples of each because you get the pattern in more, right? And so then after they've written several types, maybe 7 or 8 different types of unintelligible language, I say, what was the process when you went from writing one type to another? And people say things like, they say, wheels were turning in my head. I had no idea were there. And and people say they can actually feel the cognitive shift when in shifting from writing one type of unintelligible language to writing another type. And it's Dr. Seuss has sold, this is about 10 years ago, I read in the New York Times. Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies.
Yeah, the cogs of the mind.
And Lewis Carroll is still going strong at 150 years, right? So this is very deeply in people. And nonsense has been a powerful spiritual modality forever. In the Christians, it's called glossolalia. Is what they do is glossolalia is the utterance of, they call it speaking in tongues. And it's the utterance of nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own language. So that when you continue, I've done it myself, by the way, you don't have to be in a religious ceremony. You can just start doing it. And you just start doing it, you let yourself go. And you don't need to be in an ecstatic state to get it started, right? But once you get it started, after, I don't know, you lose track of time, but after a little while, you really get into a profound ecstasy. And then the koans, right, in Zen Buddhism, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Right. Well, the point of that is that the Zen master assigns the koan to the student, who then tries to solve it by logic. But eventually, their circuits go berserk, and so it puts them into a state beyond um, um, logic. And in the
You're pattern
Hindu
interrupting
tradition,
by
it's
design.
erasure is erasing the subject of discourse, like an old TV set on the table, but with all the tubes and wires missing and the case gone. And there's no table, but it's like erasing the subject of discourse. And in the Yoga Vashistha, for example, there's the story of the three non-existent princes, right? Who were born three non-existent princes lived in the city long before it was built, and long before any of their relatives were born. And so they went from the city on a trip, and they bathed in three rivers that were dry. So and it's erasure, and it's a form of nonsense which brings about, it brings about a sense of the ephemeral nature of life.
Because, that was going to be my question in terms of we're pattern interrupting, we're disrupting, we're erasing, we're like trying to, it's almost, I don't say escape, but almost like break through to find what's sort of permeating underneath the substrate of this narrative, cohered experience that we're having.
I got you. I'm wondering myself. I don't know as much.
Yo.
David Hume said, he said, I think the only kind of afterlife that a philosophical person could entertain would be a reincarnation. And he doesn't say why, but, I think, he was a great historian, as well as a philosopher. And so he would have understood the role of narrative and the necessity of narrative in human nature. And that's what I think I think that that's where I've come to. That's what happens, I gather, is you finish up in this story, and then you go through some incomprehensible process, and you're back on another storyline. And I wonder, it's like, in the Canterbury Tales, if you ever read that, it's like it's all these pilgrims going on a trip to Canterbury to visit the shrine or something. But that story is a structure to tell the stories that make up the Canterbury Tales. See, in other words, that the baker goes along on the trip, right? And so and they tell the stories to amuse each other when they're walking. See, and there's another one like that, Boccaccio, in he wrote the Decameron, which is a similar thing. It's like these people are caught in the plague of Milan, so they go to a villa in the countryside to isolate themselves till the plague goes over. And to pass the time, they tell each other stories, and that's what the Decameron. And what that's called is a frame narrative. There's another good one by Ray Bradbury, if you ever heard of him. Ray Bradbury had The Illustrated Man, which was this transient man goes down by the railroad track at night, and he sees a hobo there who's completely covered in tattoos. And then the hobo goes to sleep by the light of the flickering fire, and the man sees the tattoos come alive, and they tell stories. And so that's called a frame narrative, right? Well, what your question was, how is this all put together? I have no idea, right? Like how all the different, it's assuming there is some kind of overstructure. I have no idea what it is.
I'm deeply fascinated at where we're at with the conversation because, as you mentioned in the beginning, you were 8 and you were having this fascination with the astronomy and our place in the world and our, kind of, what's out there and really what we've ended up with. And is what's in here, and even what's, what is underneath the substrate of it. And I think one of the things that enamors me the most about, because there's such a field of knowledge here, and we can talk about the different strands of knowledge, I guess, but just the coming home to the I don't know and being okay with that. I think there's actually some really deep, profound elements of wisdom in there, because it can sound sort of flippant to sort of be like, I don't know, but actually there's a really deep solidity that's actually required to be able to stand in an I don't know, because many people actually, I don't want to sound like this, but like religion, many different places, schools of thoughts, philosophies, like they will run towards a dogma because it's a bit more comforting,
Yes,
and then it's
that's
actually
right.
uncomfortable
And it's
standing in
it's
an
a
I don't
false
know.
comfort too, because they're always miserable. Because otherwise, if they were really sure, they wouldn't be having to try to convince everybody else, right? They try to convince everybody else because they themselves are unsure, right? And that's the reality of it. But it's like I try to imagine that inner world of somebody, and it seems miserable. Because you can't fool yourself. By definition, you have to know that you're fooling yourself at some level, right? So that's why ideologues are always so miserable. And it's like, to me, it's the fun of it is to acknowledge that I don't know much, and to try to exert my reason as rigorously as I can to try to get down as much as I can.
Can I ask about that from a personal perspective? Because I find understood that, like, when we don't actually know, but then having a targeted belief towards something then does actually support you, and then you have this frame of choice in terms of what am I going to believe, and that reflects who you are back in the pursuit. Certain things you believe in are supportive, certain things you believe in may not be supportive. And I think, there is this divinity underneath all of that, right? Because each incarnation is meant to know its own journey, and the universe as a whole is witnessing itself through that. But there is this choice of belief, supportive, not supportive, to sort of, it can be quite healing to sort of orient yourself towards the belief. But then also there's this almost knowing that you don't know underneath the substrate of that is what you're
Yeah,
inviting in
I'm
there.
comfortable with not knowing. And also, it's like I am not a religious person, but I do have a relationship with God. And I talk to God every day, and He's never said a word to me about religion. So I just figure I'm not interested in that. It's to
Can you
me,
reconcile that with the I don't know? Can you? Sorry, because you don't know, and then you've got a relationship with God.
yeah, because man, I realize my relationship with God that I can't be in charge of that. I just sort of turn myself over, and it's very nice. But what I'm getting at is that I want to find out what is. That's what I want to do, and the best way to do it is to hone your logical skills and your reason to the sharpest you can get it, and to object to every single thought you have and try to figure out why it's wrong rather than to try to figure out why it's right. And that it ends up to me being so much fun, because what little I can kind of get a hold of and get pretty confident of, that it gives me a certain amount of confidence that I'm right, but always within the context that I just am willing to be proven wrong. In August, Amrit, I'm going to make a statement at a meeting that I have a verifiable breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of the question of an afterlife. And I'm putting it that way because I want to be refuted. It's like, to me, the best way to do it is to put your view out there and as clearly as you can, and get your argument as clearly as you can. And then putting out there on the paradoxical, not exactly hope, but just kind of thinking, well, if my colleagues find a hole in it, then I'm benefited, right? Because I see my mistake. But if my colleagues unanimously say there's no mistake in it, that gives me a certain amount of confidence. And I am pretty confident that what's going to come out of this is people going to say, yeah, he's right. But what it's going to do is that in reality, we can't come up with a proof of life after death with the mind we have and the logic we have. And for many, that is translated into it's impossible. Right? But I say that it's accurate what David Hume and A.J. Ayer and others said, that, yeah, the question is of an afterlife is not commensurable with logic as we have it. And it's not, and it's not intelligible. And there is no, even though there's a good feeling and images that come with it, there's no cognitive content that could be put to a test. That's the reality. And some people think of that as despair, but I say no. What we need to do is we need to extend the logic we have so that we can, the logic we have is geared to true or false statements of literal meaning. But the sentence, there is life after death, is not a true or false statement of literal meaning. So the first thing we got to do is we got to work on the intelligibility of it. Go back in your mind to the year 1915 and be a highly literate and educated and informed person of the year 1915. And now listen to this sentence. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that was totally nonsense. It's unintelligible. Now add the knowledge of role of DNA and heredity, gene splicing, gene editing, cloning, and you've got an intelligible scenario, right? It now in 2025, it makes intelligible sense in a way it didn't in 1915, right? Not that it's true yet, but that we can understand how it could be, right? Or go back into 1915 and listen to this. I watched a movie on my phone this morning, right? And so unintelligibility is a shiftable phenomenon. And where we are in now is we are in a phase where, due to the advent of near-death experiences, the question of an afterlife is becoming more intelligible. Because in 1915, near-death experiences occurred, but they were extraordinarily rare. In 1925, in 2025, they occur all the time because of the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, right? So what was once a very rare and extraordinary thing is now becoming the point where everybody knows somebody who's had a near-death experience. So everybody on the earth probably has a contact point, right? Somebody who's been there. And this is, it's necessarily bringing about a sort of reconfiguration of our ways of thinking about life after death.
At this point, what do you think? You've obviously would have spent some time contemplating the ancient Egyptians, like their embalming bodies, like their relationship with the afterlife, because they're spending quite a bit of resources, energy into some people, like their final preparations for what they believe to be an afterlife. What do you think that they knew that we didn't?
Oh, the Egyptians?
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to know what to make of the Egyptians because I mentioned earlier that the Christians took Plato's Phaedo as their theology of the afterlife. Well, then a couple of millennia passed, and then in the 19th century, there was a scholar in Germany, and his name, as I remember, I think his last name was Erman. Erman. And when all of that archaeological stuff began to come back from Europe, from Egypt in the 19th century, I guess it was, then the scholars were really into this. And so what they did was they projected the Christian view of the afterlife onto the ancient Greek material, onto the ancient Egyptian material.
Mm.
And there's a really great book by the Princeton University Press called Yearning for Immortality, which tells that whole story. So it's hard to say because, what you and I have learned of the Egyptian afterlife has been filtered through Christian. Not that they did it maliciously, but it was just, that was so just and that's the way they think. Yeah.
Yeah. Your premise that you're putting forward in August, is that, again, tying us back, is it largely, is a large part of it this shared death experience that speaks to that? And can you tell us about shared death experiences a little bit more? Because I think we opened it, but we didn't close it. Like, people are actually experiencing
Yeah, it's
each other's near-death experiences together. Is that what's going on? But they're not actually
I don't
dying?
know what's
Like,
going
yeah,
on, but I mean, it's really but it happens all the
well, can you describe the
is that
can you describe the phenomenon?
yeah, people who are there at the bedside of someone else who is dying, that it's a fairly common thing that the bystanders themselves, who are not ill or injured, nonetheless have various aspects of this thing we call a near-death experience when it happens to somebody who almost dies. And for example, a person standing there as grandma dies may say that as grandma died, I lifted out of my body and I went part way toward her with the light. Let me give you an example of this. Years ago, I met this family practitioner from Maine, the state of Maine, right? And he had been like a GP there in Maine for many years. And he had an elderly patient. He had her for many years. And she had what is called a cor bovinum, which is people who have high hypertension for a long period of time. Their hearts get sort of circular, like the heart of a cow. Okay, it's like more than a circle, and it's just from the pressure in the hearts, over a long period of time. So they have these big globular hearts, and they're very irritable, right? So this elderly woman had this condition, and so and her final stay in the hospital, when she would have a cardiac arrest, they would zap her, and it would quickly bring her back. And she said, I'm finished. Don't do this anymore. I'm ready to go, And so, but that's a really hard thing for doctors to digest, I mean, they want to do their best. And so, but an agreement was made. There was a woman there who had been a friend of this dying woman for many years. And the companion of the dying woman said, I'll be okay with this. Let me, I'll be there. And so then the medical group kind of backed off, right? And then the next time it happened, her friend was there with her. And the friend was like embracing her, right? And when the elderly woman's heart stopped this time, it startled her companion. And so she jerked like that, and it started, and oh my God, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. So, they backed off again. And the next time it happened, it did. The lady died. But the companion told my doctor friend that as her friend died, that she herself lifted out of her body and went upward, and she could see the relatives and friends of her dying friends, coming to get her. And then the companion went back to her body. Or people say that as the dying person, like for some years ago, my wife and I got a communication from an emergency room doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And he said, as that patient was dying, the doctor told us that the whole life of this man just came around in a total panorama. The doctor got to see it all. I mean, and I've just heard this kind of thing. It happens. I mean, it's certainly extraordinary and counterintuitive, but it happens. Or people will say that they see apparitions of the dying person's loved ones who died come into the room as though or people say the room fills with light.
Is the proximity, the person that's sharing the shared death experience with the person that's experiencing that is actually having the experience of dying / is dying, is it the physical proximity,
Well,
or is it familial
is
lineage proximity?
Most commonly it is.
So it's purely physical. So you don't have to be related. It's just
No,
the
you
physical
don't have to
proximity.
be related, and it's most commonly physical proximity, but not invariably. It's, for example, I just have so many people over the years saying that, they were in Europe when their mother died in the United States, and at that very moment, I just hear this all the time. I mean, or I had a wonderful student who was she ended up being a hospice nurse, but she was a psychology student of mine. And she said that she knew that her grandmother was in the hospital, and she started her car and started going to the hospital to see her grandma. But she said that her grandma was just sitting there in the front seat with her and said, "I'm dead." Right? And, I mean, these things happen. They make really, they have powerful impact on people when they happen.
Can you tell us about, if it's okay, your relationship with your mother and Mother's Day and your near-death experience? Like
Yeah, well, I had that. Yeah, I had been studying this
Please.
for some years when I happened to have it myself, and it's what it made me realize is that you can't really describe it. But basically, I as my mother was dying, the room we were in changed geometrical configuration. I was no longer in a three-dimensional space, and I have no way to describe it. It's like looking at one of those Escher pictures, right? You can't, where am I? Right? It's not three-dimensional space, but you don't have the words or concepts to make sense of it. But I also heard her not in my auditory system, but as she was dying, she talking in my head. I mean, and then my sister felt the presence of my father who had died 18 months before. I mean, and my brother-in-law, my wife. I mean, and I don't, I can say that it happened. I can't give you an explanation for it, but I know it happens to a lot of people.
Inspired souls, lumen beings, you're obviously enjoying this video, so please do give it a like and a thumbs up. It votes for this kind of content online here at YouTube. And join in on the conversation below. We'd love to hear what you're taking away from today's incredibly deep and rich conversation. There are so many things going on in this conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody, the philosophy, the death, the history. What is your favorite takeaway from today's conversation? And Dr. Raymond Moody is likely to be back on in the future. If you've got any questions for him, please leave them in the comments below too, and I can ask them the next time he comes back on. Back to Dr. Raymond in today's podcast. You've had some very interesting stories of people coming into their near-death experiences and then, just coming back from the light. What's some that's really stood out for you in particular that's left a visceral impression on you?
I tell you what, it's the one that the first living person I knew who had a near-death experience was Dr. George Ritchie. And I heard about his experience when I was an undergraduate philosophy student at the University of Virginia. In 1965 was when I heard his story. Okay, and I should say that George Ritchie is from Richmond, Virginia. And my mother and father are from Porterdale, Georgia. Okay, now, George Ritchie's experience took place at Camp Barkley, Texas in December 1943 when he was a recruit in the Army doing his basic training. And now, he was pronounced dead in December 20th, I think it was, 1943. And the doctor, was just blown away. The doctor, Frankie was his name, and he was just blown away by this. But anyway, now, hearing George's experience in 1965 was what put me on this quest. And after my book was already published, it was published in November of 75, and I dedicated it to George Ritchie. The only contact I'd had with George Ritchie in all those years was I asked him if I could dedicate the book to him, right? And so in November of 75, it was published. And I was at that time a medical student in Georgia. So I decided to go back to Charlottesville, Virginia, to do my residency in psychiatry. So in March of 1976, I went up to Charlottesville to do my interview to be a psychiatry resident. And while I was there, I just called Dr. Ritchie. I'm in town. It's very nice, invited us over to dinner, had a nice chat. The next day, I went back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived then, and they were taking care of my kids. And I very casually mentioned to my dad that evening in the den that the day before I'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, who was the first person I knew who had this experience. And by then, my father had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience. And this is what my father said. George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. I was there, and so were you. My mom and dad had moved to Camp Barkley in early September 1943, so my dad could go to officers' candidate school. I was conceived in late September. George's experience was December 20th, and my mom and dad moved away from Camp Barkley December 29th. I was there in utero when that happened. And that's pretty striking. Flash forward a couple of years ago.
Flash forward?
Some people were going to film George Ritchie's story. And so they were thinking, they're putting this now as a production going on. So they said, well, wouldn't it be nice to film it at Camp Barkley where it happened? And so they got in touch with the property office in Texas to see, and it turned out that the property had been sold some years before, to a couple from Texas who were going to make it into an exotic game farm. But the wife had an accident on the farm, on the property, and was thrown down and had a near-death experience. And the light came to her and told her not to do the game farm. It's now a mission to help people in Honduras.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, makes you really wonder.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. The tapestry of the fabric of reality. It makes you wonder about the fabric of reality.
It's really, God is, he's a great director and screenplay writer, if you ask me.
I was hoping to ask you this as we come to a close today, your relationship with God. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you define God, please?
Well, I give up on that one because, it's, people are always
can you give us
asking, Raymond, do you believe that God exists, right? And I say, absolutely not, because because I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being, and any belief that I could formulate about God would be bound to be off base, right? Plus, if you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of the sentence is on the word exist. Now, as a logic professor, it'd take me about an hour probably to do it well. But we could sit down and I could show you what it means to say that something exists. And I could even show you how to symbolize it in logical notation. But when it comes to God, I give up, right? Somebody who wants to know whether God exists is trying to draw this circle of a concept around God. I say, God, I give up on that one. What I say is I have a relationship with God. See, it's a
You speak
different
to him
thing.
every day.
It's not
Yeah.
concepts, it's relationships. And it's over a period of time you see it unfold. It's
How has that
and I'm
relationship
not
enriched
religious,
you
you
and
know.
how has that relationship enriched you in your life?
Well, in understanding and just gradually realizing what this thing we're in is a kind of movie, I guess. I mean, I don't know what you think, but it's I think this is the movies that we're in. And people and if as a logician is listening in, they say, well, Raymond just committed a logical fallacy, right? Which is one of Aristotle's original logical fallacies, and he wrote about it in his original book on it, was the fallacy of literalizing a metaphor, right? Which is to say that what Raymond Moody is saying there is that he's taking one aspect of human life, namely the theater, right? And he's projecting this out as a model of the whole, and that is a logical fallacy, which it is, except that's not what I'm doing. I say it happened the other way around. I say that the reason why we have theater is that wise people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, who were the public intellectuals of their day, had the insight that I saw all the time in my elderly geriatric psychiatry patients who were this was like a VIP clinic where the town celebrities go, because in a small town it's an unkind thing to make the chief of police have to show up at the front door of the mental health clinic, or the local movie star, right? So so I was the oldest resident, plus I was known for and I had the PhD in philosophy, so I was it, right? So for a year, just listening to very distinguished elderly people who were there, I quickly realized it was the main thing was loneliness. They just wanted somebody to talk to, or situational stress. But during that year of these constant people reflecting back on, right, Raymond, like the older I get, more I get this uncanny impression, when I look back on my life, that it's been a movie or a play or a drama or a novel or a story, a script. They use different words. And it's just part of, and so I think what happened was that day when there was a traditional harvest festival where the chorus sang the old stories. And for reasons unknown, this one performance, this guy, Thespis, stepped forward from the chorus and spoke his own lines. It created a sensation. What are the Greeks all about? Competition. Think, the Olympic Games, right? And so what was the first response when it created a sensation was, let's have a contest, right? Like, first winner, Aeschylus, then Sophocles, then Euripides, then it's 50 years the theater is a profession, right? That's not something that comes from human invention. That was something that is sort of pasted on top of that
Permeating
storytelling
from the
is what it was all
substrate.
about,
Yeah,
right?
permeating from the
It's
substrate. Yeah.
and so it's the reason we want to have theater is that elderly people realize at a certain point that life is a story.
It's what the I guess that's what the Hindus and the Dharmic cultures sort of and the Dharmic cultures in the East sort of point to as Maya. They call it the illusion.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
in the West.
theater.
In the West they translate it to illusion, but I think I find it really difficult personally being Indian with that translation, because illusion means it doesn't quite it's a very 2D word, and Maya is actually like infinitely
That's right.
dimensional. It doesn't quite
That's right. When I
capture it.
told this, my theory about 10 or 15 years ago down at a ashram, the Swami said, "Yeah, that's what we think too." That was his comment.
Yeah. I can't help but remark upon one of these stories that I heard from, it was one of the philosophical meanderings of Alan Watts. And he would say, this was the first he was encouraging the contemplation of death. And I'd love to get your insights on why, this is also important. He would say, at some point, let's just imagine you're living a story, and you're able to choose the story that you're living, right? One day you'd wake up and you'd say, "Hey, I'd want to go meet the girl, and get the house, and have a great story like those, first person narrative." The next day it's like, if you did that a few hundred times, and afterwards you'd sort of say, "Hey, I'd like there to be a bit of a twist, like a bit of a roller coaster in the story. Like this time I meet the girl, but something happens, and then and then I get the house, and then." And he goes, what happens if I go through the story but I never meet the girl?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then fast forward and he's like, what happens if I live a story? And then he goes, but I'm viscerally aware every time that I'm living a story. What if I dream a dream that I forget that I'm dreaming?
Yeah. There's it's something like that. What Plato said was, he said, and Plato was really funny, because of his, his stature. People don't want to see that, but a lot of his writings are very funny. In his The Republic, where he's talking about the soldier who was believed dead and came back and related his near-death experience. And so the soldier is talking about how just before people come back, right, that they've been over there and now they're going to come back on their new reincarnation. He said they go through a process, and there's a person there called the mantis. Mantis, M-A-N-T-I-S. Its prophet is not exactly right for English, but it's something that's like a person who knows because of some non-normal way of, seeing or whatever. And so the mantis is there to help to counsel people as they're selecting their next life, right? And so he doesn't direct their attention to lives, he directs it to patterns of lives. Like they're to look at different patterns of lives from which they can choose. And then the funny thing is, this mantis is kind of making an offhand comment that it's astonishing to me. You can feel his astonishment, like that. Most people just choose pretty much what they were on before, right? You know what I mean? I would like to venture out, but this guy's astonished that people keep choosing like the similar things. But then you're traveling, see, and to go back to here, and you come and you drink from the river of forgetfulness, whose waters no vessel can contain, and you forget all you know, see? And it's like, that's what's called by psychologists an event boundary. And you've had it, I've had it, everybody's had it. You're sitting in your living room, right? And you decide you want to go into the kitchen to get something. And as soon as you go into the kitchen, you forgot what you came in there for, right? That's an event boundary. And I think it's really interesting that that Plato puts that right on just before we come here. And Plato says some people really just drink it all in. They forget everything. They're the kind of people who just have no curiosity and watch football games on TV all day, right? But then there are other people who just take a few sips and they come back and they can remember pretty much, or some things that happened.
Can I ask you about the event boundary on the other side now? And now you're 81, I think. And how do you feel about your death and that event
Well,
boundary?
I just over the years I've had a lot of patients come to me because of fear of death, right? And so when I quickly realized that fear of death is no one thing. When somebody comes to you for fear of death, the first thing you got to ask is that, what about it? What about death is it you're afraid of? And where I am, I'll tell you exactly where I am. Pain. I don't want any pain. That's my fear of death, right? And please, no pain. I've had kidney stones. I'm finished with pain, I hope, right? But then other people are afraid, and some people are afraid of the pain they imagine might go on. Some people are afraid of hell because they've had some religious indoctrination and they're afraid to gonna go to hell. Some people are afraid of obliteration. Some people are afraid of the unknown, right? And some people like me, where I am, I hope I can get by without pain. And also, for now, I want to stay around for my kids and my wife. We got two wonderful kids, and they're on their way. I want to stay around a little longer to get them underway and with my wife. But that's not up to me really. It's up to God. But it's and so I would and I have finished this new book called Swan Song. And ideally, I would like to see it published, right? I mean, to be around when it's published. But I am not afraid of death as obliteration, and there's a certain amount of unknown to it. But I'm not afraid of death. No, it's life that scares me. To tell you the truth. I mean, I was a forensic psychiatrist, Amrit. I mean, and that stuff wears on you. I mean, in a way, because it is so fascinating, right? It's like
Mm.
because when I was doing this back in the '80s, '70s, and '80s, my friends literally thought that I was crazy. Like we could be in a air-conditioned office talking with neurotic people who are, not nearly as bad off as he is and making good money. But, instead he's working at a unit where they keep psychotic killers, right? But to me, it is fascinating. I had the great privilege of being able to. When I was a kid, I used to imagine all day in the seventh grade, I'd sit there trying to imagine flying out to Mars or Venus or whatever the target was that day and to get back before the bell rang at 3 o'clock and hoping the teacher didn't call on me to ask anything because I was out in space. And then one day I was walking up the hill to my place of employment and, to talk with psychotic killers. And I realized, oh my God, I'm Raymond Moody. I'm the guy who in the seventh grade spent all day just imagining traveling out to other planets. And I said, well, I can visit 15 or 20 different planets today if I want to. It was just that bizarre. But therefore, a very great opportunity to test your skill in interdimensional thinking because nobody was in this. We had 120 violent killers at any one time, and every one of them had a different world that they were in. But see, you have to do 15, and it's so fascinating. You can't wait to come in the morning. What have the police brought in now? That was the attitude, right? It was just fantastically exciting. But you have to talk to 15 killers in a day is the average, patient number you'd see. So you don't have time to process it, right? And so you just get up and you go the next day. Well, then it sneaks up on you. And a few years ago, I was having bad dreams. It's just like, it all coming back on me. But it's fascinating and it's part of life. And it was a really, really because I mean, in this situation, and I used to teach homicide in universities too. I was, my family was law enforcement, and I just, rode around in a cop car when I was a kid with my uncle, who was a chief of police. And my brother I rode with him all the time too, and he was a sheriff. And so, I mean, it just shows you a side of life that most people don't get the opportunity and privilege as it is of witnessing. And but then I went through that period where I was having disturbing dreams because you don't process it when it's too intense, and then it comes out later. But you know what? It's just like everybody. Why is homicide so fascinating? Right? That's when I took forensic psychiatry. One of my professors, like one of their very early, professors, said, "You guys are interested in murder, right?" Yeah, yeah. Well, and he said, well, where are we going to start in your study of murder? Like, well, where do we begin in teaching you about homicide? And he said, and where we begin is we ask you, why are you interested in this?
He turned the light back in on itself.
And there you go. And so I've spent a lot of time as a teacher of homicide in law enforcement, and the reason people are so interested in homicide, look at all the TV shows now, right? The reason is, number one, everybody has thought about killing somebody, right? Everybody has thought about killing somebody. And number two, it's dramatic. I like to say homicide is story, right? There's always a story to it, right? And homicide is a narrative phenomenon. And it was so strange to me, Amrit, because, I was talking to these very psychotic killers who just, the delusions, and a man who thought he was a wolf, and a man who worshipped pigeons, and a man who ground his mother and father up in a meat grinder. I mean, this was my daily fare. So then I'm traveling around the state of Georgia testifying in these trials on psychotic killers. And everybody in law enforcement in the state knew my uncle fairly very well, he was a famous chief of police. And a lot of them knew my brother. And so whereas mostly cops mostly are kind of suspicious of psychiatrists, really, and that's the reality. But since I was Fairleigh Waddleton's nephew and Randy Moody's brother, I was accepted. And so then I would go to these little towns, and then the judge, would be, get to know the judge, and then the judge would have some friend who had done terrible thing, like a man who he's the king, the president of the Kiwanis Club, right? And 55 years old, everybody in town knew him because when he was 18, he made that pass, right? And he was the deacon in the church and the Chamber of Commerce and then, he hired his sociopath brother to kill his inconvenient girlfriend, right? Well, now the judge, who's known him all his life, said, Raymond, there's got to be a screw loose somewhere, right? So then, because I was interviewing these psychotic people, I started interviewing a lot of people who were not insane, but who just like in the what you would regard as a okay state of mind when they committed homicide. And what I found was they are so much weirder than the psychotic people. I mean, it gets the
Mm.
first premise is their first premise is always I'm smarter than the police. That's the and then they build a story from there. And you can't I tell you the
So
truth,
true.
it's the main skill you had to cultivate was the skill of not laughing in somebody's face.
Well, that's the comedian in you again coming in handy, right? Learning timing. Were you at no point afraid that, I mean, coming into contact and in this line of work, that you yourself would have your psychological frame popped? It seems like it was stretched time and time again, and you were, fascinated by that.
Oh, yeah, and
But were you not afraid that you, like, at some point it would puncture and you yourself would go into like some sort of break? It seems like you have then had to process it, like you said recently,
yeah. Well,
like
I
in your
mean,
dreams.
that
But
was
were you not? Did you
complicated
not
by the
carry that
fact that I
fear at
did
some
have
point that it would just?
hypothyroidism. Yeah, I mean, I had a physical illness about that time too. But but in terms of your question, touched on me that I didn't say the third thing. It's like the people are fascinated by homicide because everybody's thought of killing somebody. Number two, because it's always a great story connected with it. And number three, because, and this is what fascinates me about it, is that every homicide is unique. Every one of them is totally unique. And yet, every single one of them reflects one or more patterns. And so once you get hooked on that, you can't stop. You just like your mind goes back and forth, see, and it's so fascinating because you recognize every one of them, that every one of them is unique, but every one of them is follows these patterns in a very complex way too. So, and it's kind of like stamp collecting. People get fascinated by stamps are, all alike and every one of them is unique, right? And that's what fascinates the mind about stamp collecting. And it's a very similar thing that fascinates the mind about homicide. Because it's so the cognitive dissonance, I guess it would be, because you're struck by the contrast between the utter uniqueness and the complete sameness of it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I can almost see in MC Escher painting the sort of, yeah, the sense making that's emerging from that substrate into like organized thought, like the chaos, yeah, and just consistently trying to find the dimensionalities of, yeah, the patterns, and then being chaos, order, and the patterns in amongst of different relative amounts of order in between those two things is, yeah, really, really something to, yeah. I mean, it's making MC Escher's work actually seem, it's yeah. I'm gonna look at some of those paintings after this, just to dive in a little bit deeper. On that note, in terms of those that you've worked with, in terms of those that have fears of death, the fear of the unknown, how do you, because there is so much unknown, how do people overcome the fear of the unknown in your experience?
Well,
How do they
I
learn
just
to work
don't
with
get it
that? And
myself. I just
but some people you would have seen carried
Yeah,
that,
some
and how did
people are
they come to
terrified
grips
of
with
the
it?
unknown. There's to some people, maybe because of their way they were trained and all, they're terrified to say, I don't know. And that's a big factor in this. And people are afraid to say that I don't know for different reasons, right? Some people had a terrible education where they were punished for not having the answer, I suppose, or um, and then in certain kind of hyper religious doctrines, you're not supposed to know anything outside of the system, right? But again, it's like you have to look at each case as to when somebody is having a difficulty with knowledge. It's like there's something called mythology. right? Misology. And misology is a hatred of argumentation and reasoning from a fear of becoming enlightened. And that sounds paradoxical, but see, it's somebody who's in a religious sect, like when I was in the Deep South as a kid, and it was the religious fundamentalist, they just didn't want to hear about evolution, right? They wanted the schools to teach the Bible instead of Darwin, right? And it's like a hatred of reason and argumentation from a fear of becoming enlightened. They don't want to learn, right? And there's another kind of misology when people are afraid of being. It's called. Well, I mean, there's different. Logomachy is one name for it. Heuristics is another. But logomachy is that's like not arguing to try to find the truth, but really to look good, right? That you want to show that you can know more than anybody else present, right? And so it becomes a contest and like I'm trying to win rather than to gain the truth. And those kinds of attitudes toward knowledge really complicate the situation, see, for somebody who's trying to inquire into the afterlife. Because a lot of people who have a religious ideology, they don't want any talking about something that's outside of their ideology.
Right. You did mention that you have mentioned that there are 3 different pursuits of knowledge. I mean, some of it, I think you mentioned this where I picked it up was in jest a little bit, but there are 3 different pursuits of knowledge.
I was
do you
thinking
know what I'm
maybe,
referring?
Bernard of Clairvaux said, some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and that is curiosity. Some seek knowledge to be known, and that is vanity. And some seek knowledge to help others, and that is love. And whereas I've always been in the first category, the second has never appealed to me because it's like I realize I don't know much of anything. And anybody who claims to know, well, I'm immediately kind of suspicious of them, right? But then the third, when I'm getting up, my wife is like that. And my friend George Ritchie was like that. He used to read the oddest books. Now, he's very brilliant. I said, and I realized finally he was reading that because he thought he could help somebody with it. And my wife is that way, that she wants new knowledge to help people. And I'm getting a little bit more that way at age 81, but I started as just pure curiosity. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to reflect back to you that, you having stoked the fire of curiosity for so long for yourself, we are all reaping many benefits from that through your work,
Well,
Dr. Raymond Moody. So there is a lot of love that we feel emanating off of you and your work and, your curiosity. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly, incredibly rich podcast, even if I can say so myself. And I would say thank you so much for your time and energy today. And I do say that. And yet this is your entire life's work. And even like George and your parents in vitro in conception is just like this conversation stands on the shoulders of your life's work and then some as well, So I just want to take a moment to deeply honor and acknowledge you.
and
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you so much. And thanks to all the folks listening in too. Thank you very much, folks, for listening to this. And, yeah.
Is there a TV on in the background?
Oh, let me see. I don't know. No, that wasn't really a TV. It was the voices in my head, but I took a little Thorazine and it stopped them right off.
I mean, there's a certain point there which you haven't managed to mention in today's. You had a choice at some point to become a forensic psychiatrist, a psychologist, or to become a comedian.
Yeah, I did. I know. It was great fun being a comedian. It's what the great thing about that is, when the audience laughs really loud, the laughter hits you on the chest like this, it vibrates. And that is just, woo, it's just a great.
It's everything.
I was thinking the other day about, see, I have this town that some called imaginary, but to me they seem very real. But I just, but it's part of my comedy thing I did. And so I talked to this Dr. Mitchell, who is the town doctor. And Dr. Mitchell has a lot of near-death experiences in his patients. And so he was having a patient the other day who he said Dr. Mitchell resuscitated him, and he said when the man came back, he said that when he got over on the other side to the tunnel, there was a hostage situation going on. And he got taken hostage.
Wait.
And so he's writing a book about it because I was taken hostage on the other side. And I just think of things like that,
Yeah,
That's what I was thinking of a couple of days ago.
that is.
The guy told Dr. Mitchell, he said, it seemed like an eternity to me. It seemed like just on and on. Dr. Mitchell said, no, you weren't dead but about 3 minutes. But the man said it seemed like an eternity to him that he was taken hostage over there.
That's sorry, there's so much in that one. I love it. I love it. Thank you. Yeah. Beautiful to feel that. Yeah, I mean, comedy must have been like a real. You can feel
I don't know where
emanating
it
through your
came
being.
from.
It's
I've
been
just always, when I was 7 years old, I wanted to be a comedian. I wanted to be an astronomer and a comedian. And when I was in junior high school, my classmates used to call me every day after class to ask me what had happened in my imaginary town that day.
Yeah, I love that.
When my mind is then free to do some creative things, I start getting these ideas, and so I'll read you some of the ideas I had this morning. Yeah, here we go. What if Jesus was kind of melded with different kinds of characters, right? Like morphed. So I'm thinking if some of the characters could be Lady Jesus. Or here's one, Super Jesus. And the Norse mythology, How about Thor Jesus? Or here's one. Here's one. Giselvis.
I can't stop. I can't picture a gyrating Jesus. Stop.
Now,
Stop.
Now, listen, I got another one. You're too young to remember, Amrit, but thank God for the internet, right? Go on the internet, right?
Yeah.
And look up. This is before your time, but you'll love it. The wrestling was a big thing on TV. And into that framework, 1949, stepped a guy named George Wagner. And this was 1949. Okay, think back to that. He let his hair grow out long blonde hair, and he had it dyed
Locks.
bleach blonde, and he had it done
Yeah.
up in curlers and all. And his wife made him these beautiful, gorgeous robes.
Mm.
And he had a valet and the valet would have a tuxedo and have a big silver tray. And
Mm.
so, gorgeous George, gorgeous George. and, and he would come into the ring and people would hate him, you know.
Yeah,
And he would
yeah,
he
yeah.
would come into the ring and his valet would throw rose petals into his path. And then before Gorgeous George would dare to go into the ring, his valet would have to go into the ring with a big bug sprayer, like they used to long handle, right, with a
Yeah.
big barrel around it for spraying bugs. But the valet would go through the ring and spray the ring out before Gorgeous George would deign to come in there.
And so now I have to visualize Jesus.
You know, and then he did every mean trick in the book. He was just so mean.
Yeah.
But then finally the good wrestler would strike back or something. And then Gorgeous George would complain to the referee, like, he mussed my hair. He mussed my hair. Oh, it's just the greatest. But look
Yeah,
him up.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
anyway,
I'm-
then in terms of this, see, the next one would be Gorgeous Jesus. See.
Gorgeous Jesus.
So that's kind of, you know, what I'm working on now. That's just-
Oh God. I have to say, your this kind of brand of humor needs saving from a little bit.
By the way, I love Indian food. Yesterday, we went to the restaurant here, and I had my favorite is chicken biryani.
Oh,
Oh,
Dr.
yeah.
Raymond, stop.
puri.
Stop.
And poor.
Did you know I literally we've got someone staying with us at the moment. She's from Peru, and I said, "What's your like?" Because I play this game with everybody. I say, "What's your favorite? Your last meal on earth? What's the entree? What's the main course? And what's the dessert?"
Great.
And she started telling me about in Peru how they have these big stuffed turkeys. And they stuff within the turkey, there's like little bits of beef and chicken and lamb and everything, and like stuffed within the stuffed turkey, and the juices from the turkey filter into. Anyway, it was sounding very divine, or bovine. I don't know. Anyway, but one of the things in there was my answer is always my mother makes a chicken biryani, Dr. Raymond, with just. Certain places make chicken biryani and it's more rice than chicken, but she gets the ratio of chicken to rice, right? Because she's making it at home.
Yeah.
She doesn't have to skimp on the chicken and the poultry, right? So she does the chicken biryani with sultanas and like cashews and just the coriander and just all the smells and my God.
I like puri, but you know, it's always a conflict. You want some naan too. But the trouble is the puri just wins out every time with me.
I think it's a texture. Yeah, they're two different textures. They're two different textures.
They are, but you know, it's both of them so good. And then I like the mango chutney too. That's in the set.
Oh yeah. You have great taste.
But I'm so glad you like Lady Jesus and Super Jesus and
I'm not sure about Gorgeous Jesus. I'm not so sure about, but and I mean Elvis. Jeez, Elvis. Jeez, Elvis.
Look him up and see some of his matches. You know,
I'm looking at it, and I don't want to look at it.
It was so outrageous.
Yeah, but I can't picture Jesus that way, even though you're trying to encourage me to. And as my brain starts to do that, the humor is.
But I can see I can see Lady Jesus. You know, I can just see her in my mind. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much. You inspired souls, living beings. You've made it through to the end of another incredible episode. Thank you so much for your inspirations to evolve. It is such an honor to be your brother walking this path by your side. You've obviously watched this video all the way through to the end, so please do give it a like and a thumbs up. It really helps voting for content like this, spirituality content here online at YouTube. To all of you that are subscribed to the channel, I really want to take a moment to just give you a heartfelt thanks. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. Thank you so much for your love, your support. We could not do this without you, every single one of you. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, at the moment, 60% of return viewers that are watching these videos haven't actually subscribed to the channel. So actually, we're at 250,000 subscribers, and that's only 40% of the actual audience, turns out, touch wood. So please do check. You might think you're subscribed, you might not be. Join the movement, spreading love, positivity, and wisdom around the planet with us. Click that button, click the subscribe button just there as I'm saying the word subscribe. It's lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution. Please hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon. Like I said, it powers and empowers absolutely everything around here. Thank you so much for your love and your support. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any deeper, on screen now, episodes with Dr. Pim van Lommel, who also studied NDEs in his own way, an incredibly rich conversation for you and his interpretation of death. And other episodes featuring some incredibly rich first-hand accounts of near-death experiences as well. So go on, take your pick and make your click, and I'll see you in the next one. See you there.